Fester's Quest is a game released by Sunsoft in 1989 for the NES. It is a run-and-gun game with some adventure elements and contains characters from the Addams Family TV series, a series that had been enjoying reruns at the time. I don't know if I would describe the game as challenging as much as frustrating, and a bulk of this frustration comes from the game's mechanics for its primary weapon, the gun. Apparently, consumers weren't the only ones aware of these trials, as the game received a design change when it was released in Europe. Let's take a look at the US release's design first and use it as a baseline. During gameplay, Fester can power up his weapons. His primary weapon is a gun, and he later acquires a whip. Whenever he picks up a blue-colored gun or whip drop from an enemy, it powers up the appropriate weapon. However, if he picks up the red-colored item drops of these words, it powers down that weapon. This is a frustrating, if not interesting, game mechanic. The whip has up to 4 levels of power. The gun has up to 8 levels. The current power level of each is shown on the inventory screen. Only one of the two can be used at a time. Both weapons change appearance as they are powered up. The whip in particular looks a lot like... I'm sure it was just a coincidence. The lowest level whip is as powerful as the highest level gun. The whip attacks on a forward path in the direction Fester is facing and can attack through walls. Naturally, it has a limited range and attack speed as it is a melee weapon. The whip's attack power helps make up for these limitations. One additional trait of the whip is Fester's ability to use it to pick up items. This is useful but can also cause some grief. The problem with this ability is that enemies drop those powered down items. This means a flurry of whip attacks to a group of enemies could leave Fester with a downgraded whip and/or downgraded gun, depending on if they drop those power downs. So spamming whip attacks may come with a price. This drops the fun factor quite a bit, as players now have to be careful after every attack with the whip. Like the whip, the gun's attack changes appearance as it is powered up. This affects the graphics used for the bullets as well as the pattern of the shots. Here are all 8 levels of gunfire along with their patterns, at least with my own best guess as to what those patterns are. At a glance, it may seem like the NES is just an absolute powerhouse of trigonometry, but really, it is just a matter of knowing how much to change the X and Y position of a shot based on a time interval to achieve the pattern desired. Fester is standing still for each of these shots. If Fester is in motion, the frequency of the pattern increases. In other words, the shots reduce their distance traveled away from him with respect to time. This is a nice feature as it gives the shots a greater opportunity to connect with enemies as opposed to going around them. If you haven't played the game before, you may ask, is this really necessary? And this question is a great segue into some additional oddities in the design of the gun's levels of power. The first concerns the patterns I mentioned earlier. While they have a certain visual appeal, they aren't very practical when it comes to attacking enemies. The reason for this has to do with collision detection between the shot and the enemy. The shots are not very forgiving when it comes to their size. As a matter of fact, the hitbox for the shots is smaller than the graphic. With gun level 3, I can fire a shot at this enemy and miss it entirely because of the firing pattern. When firing a shot, the game uses the current gun level to retrieve the shot's dimensions. Gun 3 is a square with all sides measuring 7 pixels. That's a little odd. I mean, the graphic tile of the shot is 8 by 8. I wrote a script to position hitboxes over the graphics of the shots and the enemies. The boxes are based on the coordinates of the objects as well as their dimensions. Sure enough, the shot's hitbox falls a bit short, as it is a 7 by 7 box superimposed over an 8 by 8 sprite. Are we sure that my hitbox is accurate? If the borders of the two boxes overlap, it is a collision. If they land right next to each other, it's a miss. If Fester fires while standing in this position, the top of the shot's hitbox lands just underneath the enemy's hitbox, as you would expect. Watch what happens when I fire from this position. Also a miss. In fact, if I turn the hitboxes off and freeze that same frame, we literally have two overlapping objects in the frame that do not register a hit. The logic gets the difference between the shot's position and the enemy's position for a given axis, then checks to see if that distance is less than the size of the shot, in this case 7 pixels, to determine if collision occurred for that axis. That means 6 pixels on the axis between the Y coordinates is still not a hit. This looks like it should be a hit. Why is it not? You want numbers? Let's talk numbers. Using map coordinates for the overworld rather than screen coordinates, Y location of the enemy is 1040, Y location of the bullet is 1033. 1040 minus 1033 is 7. Is 7 less than 7? No. Therefore, no collision. That is how tight the hitboxes are for collision detection. Sometimes hitboxes in games are a little larger than the sprite itself, a gimme for the player that requires less shot accuracy. But in the case of Fester's Quest, you have some degree of graphical overlap and a hit still doesn't register. Each of the first 6 gun levels has a shot size of 7x7, the last 2 levels are 8x8. The size for each of the 8 levels is stored in 8 consecutive bytes, beginning at ROM location 9D4D. These are the locations we would alter if we wanted to change the size of the shots. Standing in the same location of our near-miss analysis, we can increase the shot size for Gun 3 to 8x8 and this time hit the enemy. So one way to balance gameplay a bit would be to increase the hitbox of each 7x7 shot to 8x8. You're looking at 6 separate Game Genie codes to increase the size of every shot if you wanted to patch the game old school style. 4 codes would do it if you just wanted to compensate for the odd firing patterns for the mid-level shots that do not go in a straight line. A 7x7 shot that is still in a straight line doesn't seem as bad. That said, you can only fit 3 Game Genie codes into a single Game Genie. So in cases like these, where we've exceeded the max number of codes for the Game Genie, perhaps we can manipulate the logic code rather than the lookup table for shot size and use fewer codes. Just hardcode a particular ROM offset for the size paired with the load instruction and always use that size. Unfortunately, the collision detection subroutine reads the size from the same ROM location twice and writes it into 2 different temporary RAM locations, one for height and one for width. I assume they have 2 reads here because they originally considered having rectangles with separate height and width rather than a square with uniform dimensions. They went with the square and didn't optimize the code. Fester's Quest is perhaps based on the Blaster Master engine, another game from Sunsoft. It is possible that these 4 lines meant to support rectangles is a leftover from that. Maybe we will hit up Blaster Master's code in the future and find out. Who knows? Finally, a few of you may wonder if we could just change the less than to less than or equal to. That's a great idea for adding an extra pixel to each dimension. However, a change like this in assembly isn't a matter of changing a single instruction in 2 places. It involves a minor tweak to code structure. In short, the modification would still put us past a couple of bytes worth of change, and therefore still require 4 or more Game Genie codes. So if you wanted to change the shot size, you could either pick your favorite 3 codes to modify that lookup table for shot dimensions, or start nesting Game Genies so you can enter more than 3 codes, something I've not tried yet. Maybe instead of 8x8, you want 9x9. So here are the codes for that. This next frustration is much more noticeable during gameplay. I'll start by asking the question, do you own a turbo controller? No? Well, the manual more or less suggests that you purchase one. I've added weapon information pulled from RAM and placed the weapon level and damage inside an overlay at the top of the screen. The level of each weapon is next to its name and the shot power of that level of weapon is in brackets. Underneath this, on the left side, is a box containing 2 columns, one labeled Timer and a second column labeled HP DR. HP is enemy health, which is what the value is right now. When the enemy is defeated, this column indicates the drop, if that enemy drops an item. Various enemies in Fester's Quest, including the first ones you see, make use of a countdown timer after an attack makes contact. Let's shoot this first enemy and watch what happens. Well, that was fast. Let's slow it down. When the shot makes contact, a damage of 1 is applied to the enemy's health and a timer begins counting down. Once it reaches 0, the enemy's health is reset. In order for Fester to defeat the enemy, consecutive shots must be landed quickly. The game mechanic behind the scenes is that Fester must get each shot to hit the enemy before the timer expires. Consecutive shots reset the timer with each hit. Failing to land enough shots to drop the enemy's HP to 0 will reset the enemy's health, and the player must start the sequence again. It is frustrating, it is time consuming, it can take a physical toll unless you have a turbo controller at the ready. The player knows this is required right from the start, as the very first enemy in the game has 8 HP, Fester's starting gun deals damage of 1, and slow button presses won't get the job done. Speaking of weapons not getting the job done, let's venture into the sewers. A chunk of gameplay for Fester's Quest takes place in the sewers. The space down here is cramped, and this creates a problem with the design of your gun's shot patterns. If you are firing at level 3 or higher, it is very likely that your shot will hit the wall and dissipate, rendering it useless. These green slimes are designed to split into additional enemies. That means you need a lot of shots to finish them off if you don't have the whip, and you may find yourself having to reposition constantly just to get your gunfire to hit them, and then watch them split again. A small hitbox for collision detection, an enemy damage timer for added frustration, and walls without favors. Once an NES game was released, it wasn't likely it would receive a revision, save for things like bug fixes, warnings to help players preserve their games, and perhaps font legibility. However, it was expected that some changes, such as language updates and publisher logos for example, would be made when a game was released in a different region. This would also allow for any tweaks to game mechanics, especially for any game balancing due to a potential change in frame rate. Fester's Quest in particular received more than just a minor bug fix. It directly addressed some of the frustrations caused by the initial release. If I load the European version and start the game, I can just walk forward and plow through enemies easily. The timer is still in place, but look at the power of gun level 1. It is 4. 4 is the same amount of damage done by gun level 8 in the original release. Here is the full list of power for each gun level for both versions. Quite a difference. The power of gun levels 7 and 8 is now high enough to take out those early enemies in a single hit, making the timer mechanic irrelevant. The higher level of damage for the guns also helps save a lot of time against the pesky slimes that split apart in the sewers. And speaking of sewers, watch this. The bullets now move through walls. Regardless of the level of Fester's gun, the walls no longer present a problem. If you've logged a lot of time in the original release of Fester's Quest, it is amazing how relieving it is to not have to deal with those walls. Let's look at some code. A single change, and 40 hex changes to and 0, and now bullets go through walls. Tiles in the game have an attribute byte made up of bits that indicate things such as whether or not a bullet can pass across it, or if Fester can walk over it, among other traits perhaps. Let's use the first gray ground tile at the start of the game as an example. I can set the highest bit for this tile to hold Fester in place. He can still shoot. I can set the second highest bit to prevent shots. Set them both, and Fester cannot move or shoot. This AND statement filters out the second highest bit, call it the wall attribute, and checks to see if it is set to determine if the bullet should be destroyed or not. The European version leaves the AND statement in place but sets the operand to 0 to force the wall check value to always be 0. Therefore, walls are no longer relevant as far as shots are concerned. The great thing about leaving the attributes of all the tiles alone in the ROM and just disabling it via code is that it only takes the modification of a single byte. And of course that means one Game Genie code opens up new possibilities. I can't help but wonder if I would have used this code if I had had it 30 years ago. If you haven't played the European release, perhaps some game time with it is required in order to answer my next question, as this video may not be enough. But what do you think about these tweaks? Are these quality of life enhancements helpful? Did they do enough? Did they do too much and make the game too easy? Are there other traits of the game that need to be addressed, such as shot patterns or respawn checkpoints of some sort? Let me know. I hope you've enjoyed this examination of Fester's Quest. Please like and subscribe to see more videos like this one, and I also have a Patreon available. Until next time, thanks for watching.